many colleagues, some of whom I've actually seen quite recently in Pakistan, many of whom I haven't seen in quite many years in India. I also know there's a range of colleagues from the MENA area and Africa as well, which others will welcome. But yes, it's so fabulous to see, people that I've collaborated with for a very long time joining us, people who we're starting to collaborate with as well, and people that we hope to work with in the future. And I think it's, from our side, it's just it's a really exciting opportunity to talk through some of the issues that we've been working with, things that we're wrestling with as well. And we hope you enjoy the sessions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Cameron. Paul, thank you.
Thank you, Azadeh, and thank you also for that fantastic introduction. I'd just like to reiterate what Cameron has said. It is just so fantastic to see so many of you from many different parts of the world here. So I'm Paul Lane. I'm the principal investigator for the Mapping Africa's Endangered Archaeological Sites and Monuments project. And for those who are not aware of that, we're working across 8 different countries in Africa, from Mali and Senegal in the west, and then Ethiopia, Sudan, Kenya, Tanzania, Zimbabwe, and Botswana. But we're hoping eventually, if we get further follow-on funding, to roll out to other countries. And if we're not covering your part of Africa and you're keen to be involved, then do please get in touch with us. I won't keep flogging the project. I just thought it useful just to highlight that. Again, I'd just like to welcome you all to this meeting. I'd like to thank Azadeh and Rebecca and Stefania for all of the hard work that they put into organizing it and pulling. And I'd like to also thank everybody who's going to be presenting in this workshop as well. But especially, I'd like to thank everybody for being here. It's really great to see such enthusiasm and interest in what we're trying to do. And I think that a key point that both projects are really keen to see, and this is what these workshops are about, is the long-term sustainability of these kinds of activities. And this means that there has to be capacity in country, commitment in country, and resource in country. And these are things that both projects take very centrally to what they're doing. And ultimately for you guys to have the control and management of these data sets. So thank you.
Thanks, Paul. So I want to start the workshop before handing over to our first speakers to start the session. I want to start the workshop with a very short 2 questions poll. I'm going to launch it now. And if you can answer these 2 questions, and this will help us to monitor and evaluate the impact of our workshop sessions. So I will ask the same exact 2 questions plus another 2 at the end of the workshop, and that will give us a way and understanding of the impact of the workshop and the topics that we included as part of the workshop. So if you can take a minute to answer these, less than a minute, but I'm going to give you a minute to answer these questions, and then I'm going to stop the poll. And it's anonymous, so you just need to answer and don't worry about your names.
I know how to interpret certain. I know how to interpret certain imagery by identifying and no.
Okay, another 10 seconds and I'm going to end the poll. Thank you all for participating at this. Again, I want to welcome you all to our fourth workshop, Remote Sensing in Archaeology, Site Detection and Monitoring. The main aim of our workshop series is to provide an opportunity to share knowledge with our stakeholders by way of introducing different technologies and methodologies being used and developed as part of our projects. And by that I mean data modeling, database design, digitizing archaeological information from legacy data, historic maps, use of remote sensing techniques, machine learnings in both site identification and monitoring. And all this is to identify and document archaeological heritage sites, understand the landscape in the regions that we are working, and monitor condition of heritage over time. We had already introduced historic maps in our last workshop as a source that you can use, and it's a very valuable source to detect archaeological sites from the time that landscape was not disturbed by urbanization and agricultural activities. Satellite imagery and or aerial photos are complementary sources to use to identify heritage archaeological sites. We can also use them to monitor and detect any changes to sites and landscapes through time. The aim of our workshop today is to start from the basics and explain what is remote sensing, when and why it is used in archaeology, and how we can use it to detect sites and monitor change over time to archaeological sites. As I mentioned, we are recording this workshop, and this is mainly and making all the recordings available on our YouTube page. I will share the link to the YouTube page shortly. And this is with the aim to make a resource library that is hoped to be of use and of value to our colleagues joining us from different countries that we're working with. You have all received the program of the workshop. Again, I'm going to add that in the chat. In our half-a-day workshop today, we have 6 different presentations, but by our by our guest speakers. And as well as by team members in MASA and MESAM. And our guests are joining us from Endangered Archaeology in the Middle East and North Africa, IMINA project, and National Institute of Advanced Studies in India. Our speakers today will talk about imagery interpretation, site identification, change detection using satellite imagery. We will see examples of site types in the Middle East and North Africa, South Asia, and different parts of Africa. We will have a live session where we will break into different breakout rooms based on regional interests, and my colleagues in each room will show you how Google Earth Pro can be used as a free and available software to explore imagery and try to detect places that can be of archaeological value from these images. Since imagery from different dates are available on Google Earth, you can also, and you will see how these different time sliders can be used and different imageries can be used to detect change over time. I will be monitoring things in the background with the help of my colleagues at both MASA and MESAM. If there is any issue, you can raise your hand or type in the chat box. If you think any presentation is going fast, there is a slow down reaction that you can choose, or you can tell us and we can slow down. Our workshop are designed to be more like webinar. We have speakers presenting, and then but after each presentation, we're gonna have 5 minutes Q&A. You can either raise your hand, or you can, along the way when presenters are presenting, you can also tap your questions in the chat box. And then at the Q&A session, I'll ask you to either read out your question, or I can read them out for our speakers to answer. So when you have questions, whenever you have them, you can feel free and type them in the chat box. And then the live 30-minute sessions in the breakout room is when it's more interactive and we want you to be more engaged. Okay, so without further ado, I want to introduce our first speakers joining us from IMINA project, Dr. Michael Fradley and Saintani Neogi from University of Oxford. The IMINA project has extensively worked and used methods of remote sensing and satellite imagery to identify and monitor change, and have developed training materials on this subject. We at MASA and MESAM projects are collaborating and borrowing their materials and building on them to add examples samples from South Asia and Africa. And it's a great pleasure to have Michael and Saintani today with us to present their methodology and kind of this introduction to what is satellite imagery, what is its use in archaeology, and how we can detect archaeological sites from imagery. So Michael and Saintani, it's over to you. You should be able to share your screen and present. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Azadeh. Michael is going to share the screen. But whilst Michael is doing it, because Michael will do most of the talking, I'll just introduce ourselves. I'm Saintani. I joined EMINA project 5 years back. And before joining the project, I knew nothing about remote sensing. I have no problems in agreeing to that. So my point is, I was a geoarchaeologist. I'm still a geoarchaeologist working in the field. But over the years, I learned the techniques of remote and the use of satellite imagery in geoarchaeology as well. So as you can see, so many people have joined the workshop. When Azadeh had done the circulation of this workshop in India, I was getting too many questions that when did you turn, a remote sensing person? I was like, don't worry, I have learned it, but Michael will do most of the talking and teach you the basics of remote sensing in archaeology and what we do in EMINA project as well. So over to you, Michael.
Thank you, Saintani. Sorry, whenever I start speaking, my dog has to come and join me. So we just have to, there's 3 of us really, I should add her name. So before I start, just a polite note is if your microphone is on, can you just mute it, because sound just keeps leaking in. Yeah, as Saintani said, and Azadeh as well, and I should also mention Azadeh used to be part of our team as well and helped build a lot of the materials that we have made. So we'll be speaking today about the kind of basics of what remote sensing is and how we use it, and really drawing on a series of in-person workshops in a kind of pre-pandemic, pre-Zoom everywhere way that we used to run our training schemes. But it's fantastic that we have these kind of events where we can speak to so many and have them recorded and shared beyond. So for me, it really is a step forward. So to start, here is a satellite image that you can see taken from Google Earth of a large settlement site in the Arabian Peninsula. So I don't know if you can see my cursor. Obviously, you have a series of ruined structures on this small hilltop. But we will also be talking about condition assessments and landscape change. And here we can see where quite recently roads and a lot of the infrastructure alongside the construction of roads is encroaching on the site. And we can also see vehicles on the roads as well. And we'll come back to these things later. But as this image won't be reappearing, I thought I'd just mention that now. It's just not letting me change slide. So yeah, the structure of what I will be speaking to you about is, again, what is remote sensing? How does satellite imagery work? Some basics on the types of satellite imagery, and then a more detail on prospection, as in identifying archaeological or heritage sites, and change detection in terms of how we start to look at landscape changes around those sites. And I'm sure many of these kind of issues will be, other speakers will be talking about in greater detail later in the workshop, specifically for South Asia and in other parts of Africa. So what is remote sensing? There are various ways of interpreting it, but in a very broad sense, remote sensing is a way of obtaining data without having a direct physical or observable link with that data source. So obtaining data from a distance in some sense or other. And particularly what we're talking about is satellite remote sensing, that is using information gathered by the sensors of a satellite to make observations about the Earth's surface. And we will also, although we're focusing on satellite imagery, we will make references to aerial photography as well, particularly historic aerial photography, during this talk. So why do we use satellite imagery in aerial photography? So it is a way of, it's a very simple way of surveying. We can identify and monitor archaeological sites, and that really is the crux of what we do at EMINA, and in a sense has carried on into our host projects that are hosting this meeting today. And EMINA was the kind of original project. We're all linked by a similar funder, the Arcadia Fund, and we were kind of almost like the the test case. So we probably made a lot more mistakes, hopefully, than our partner projects are making in terms of how we've gone about this process. So one of the huge positives is we can cover huge areas in much less time. So on a horizontal plane, it's very rapid. We can look at large areas and quickly identify sites where possible. Obviously, the negative of that is that we don't have a kind of a deep vertical resolution. It's very difficult to understand exactly what a site is from a remote point, and also dating of a site can be very difficult, and often we're having to draw from analogies from what we know about sites on the ground. We can also provide data on locations that might not otherwise be accessible, and that's a huge issue for our project, which began in 2015, but it was instigated through a number of factors, but particularly in terms of a lot of the conflict that was then, well, and in many cases still is occurring in the Middle East and North Africa, related to both civil conflicts and the rise of groups like the Islamic State. So areas where, as as foreign archaeologists, we wouldn't be able to visit, but even archaeologists working in those environments, access is very difficult. And so this provides a kind of a route around that. As I said, in terms of the access they provide, is that one perspective, the aerial perspective. So there is there are lots of limitations on top of it, but it's a way of balancing the kind of cost and benefits of what we can do with it. And it really has been changed by the availability of free satellite imagery, particularly through Google Earth, but other systems such as Bing Maps. And that has meant that we have not got that upfront cost of having to purchase either aerial photography or satellite imagery of an area, or access archives when trying to reach aerial photography as we would have in the past. So it economically has made it a lot more accessible to anybody with an internet connection. But it's not a case of having to, looking at an image and knowing exactly what's going on straight away. There is a process of having to try and understand what we're seeing and how it relates to the archaeology we are used to seeing on the ground. So again, taking that knowledge of how we understand sites on the ground. And when we would run our training courses for teams, particularly working with Azadeh in Jordan, often I would begin by asking attendees, particularly if they've never used satellite imagery, is to start by looking at your landscapes that where you grew up, where you live now, and trying to understand those landscapes as you understand them on the ground and how they are represented from a satellite perspective. And ideally, when we are doing any kind of remote survey, we're identifying all these sites. And in a perfect world where resources were limitless, we would go and check every site to make sure that we have observed something that's archaeological, and we could then, where we've made mistakes, we can use that to improve the way that we do survey in the future and gather more details about those sites. Although in reality, as we all know, those resources often aren't there. So we are often creating data about sites that we know very little, and we're really leaving it to future archaeologists or archaeologists in other sectors to hopefully take that forward at some point in the future. And that's why a large part of our project is producing data sets that are then open access, that people can take this kind of very basic ground satellite imagery based data that we've collected and taking that forward. So we talked about the sensors of a satellite and how that's what's being collected. So very quickly, because it's not something I know a great deal about, but the electromagnetic spectrum, and here is quite a nice diagram that we have stolen from someone else on the internet. We have credited them, so it's not complete stealing. So we have the electromagnetic spectrum, these different wavelengths, that some of these terms that we'll know about, gamma rays, X-rays, ultraviolet. So we have all these different wavelengths, but only a very small portion of it can we observe ourselves. This tiny part of those wavelengths, we have this visible light spectrum, and on top of that we have the audible spectrum within the radio wave section of the spectrum. And so different satellites have been set up for different purposes, and they will collect different parts of this spectrum. Many collect the visible elements, but some are specifically for other parts of this wavelength of collecting data about the Earth. And so one of the interesting things about using satellite imagery particularly over earlier aerial photography, which is basically providing us that visible band, is that we can start to analyze these different bands, and they will often allow us to observe different changes on the ground that we can't see in the visible spectrum. So another borrowed image showing that how important it is that we detect this material from space, because this is basically showing these larger peaks in this graph are parts of the spectrum that we can't collect from the ground, or not very easily, and they're best observed from space. So going from the gamma rays and X-rays at the top end of that previous image through to that visible section, and then obviously we know that we can detect radio waves from ground stations, but it just shows how little we can observe without having that space-based collection. Now, I'm going to run over that quickly, and here again saying how all different materials have a different representation in that spectral. Sorry, somebody want to mute that? So that, again, it's allowing us to detect different types of features on the ground. We are starting, you'll have seen hopefully archaeological papers where people are doing this kind of multispectral analysis. We're sometimes producing very interesting results, but it's not what we're doing en masse, partly because it's very difficult to get imagery that we can do this analysis on at a high resolution. So we're able to do it on lower resolution images, and we'll talk about the resolutions in a moment. But generally, in terms of rapid working on the ground, particularly in AMINA, and again, we are reflecting on what we've done in the AMINA project, we very rarely have the time to kind of work through that kind of processing. But that is there, and that really is the kind of the cutting edge of what we're doing in terms of satellite imagery analysis. So again, I mentioned resolution. There are different ways that we can talk about that resolution in terms of the radiometric, the spatial, the spectral, and the temporal. But what we really are talking about when we're talking about the visual analysis of a satellite image is the spatial resolution when we talk about resolution. And so we have different types of imagery that we can access. We have this high resolution kind of imagery that we'll know from systems such as Google Earth. And the problem there is that we can't do that multispectral analysis through those kind of programs because we're just provided with the end product, the processed imagery that we can't reprocess, and we don't know the processing background of. So that's kind of one of those limitations to that multispectral analysis. We have more kind of medium resolution imagery through things that you'll have heard of, things like the kind of Landsat imagery and other free sources like that, going down to much lower resolution imagery. And in terms of that spatial analysis, we can see with each pixel of that image, and we are able to observe less and less. So this is the same site seen at those different resolutions. So when we talk about 0.5 meter resolution, we're talking about every kind of half a meter square on the ground is visible as one pixel, roughly, and that kind of continues up through that lowering of resolution. And again, to reaffirm that, we have that high resolution satellite imagery that we talked about. We have lower and medium resolution satellite imagery sources, and we have historical satellite imagery, which is an important resource, which is kind of probably more at the high resolution level, but with some kind of different factors kind of leaking into that. So as you'd imagine, high resolution imagery, it's very accurate. We're able to observe a lot of features, and through systems like Google Earth, we're able to often have multiple images of the same site, so we can detect different parts about the site just via visual analysis, and often we have images through time which will allow us to see any changes to those sites. So traditionally, high resolution has been kind of half a meter, really up to 2 meters, but in terms of what we receive through things like Google Earth, it's been half a meter to 1 meter, but we're now seeing kind of a new generation of satellite imagery coming through, and particularly through companies like Maxar and soon Airbus through their Pleiades fleet, that's going down to kind of 0.3 meters. And again, zooming in and showing that kind of level of detail, we can see this is a large tail site. And we can see the individual structures, and we can even observe different, interpret different forms of structure. So here's a classical theatre, we can see a dome on this structure, a possible mosque, and many other structures within that area. So lower medium resolution imagery, obviously we can detect a lot less on those. Smaller archaeological sites are just not going to be visible, but we do then have the option of undertaking different forms of multispectral analysis, because we can freely obtain the raw kind of imagery files. And so here's an attempt to work that kind of analysis here in a field system, and we can see it looks like a dammed river here at the bottom. And then we have historical satellite imagery, and this was again one of the things that kind of kick-started interest in remote sensing. Well, from the later 90s, but really in the first decade of the 2000s. So we had, during the Cold War, we had the US was collecting satellite imagery from around the world using a series of satellites. And from 1996, they began to declassify that imagery. And a positive of it, although there is a cost for scanning these images and accessing them, once somebody has scanned each scene, it becomes free to download to anyone afterwards. So it's really good for projects like ours, where sometimes we have those resources to scan imagery, but once we've done that, they're freely accessible to everyone else. They're panchromatic, so this is kind of a negative, so they're black and white, so you're having to kind of adjust the way you're interpreting a site. They often need to be geo-rectified, as in you have a satellite image, but you have to geo-rectify it to kind of a base so that you know exactly where the locations are. And it can be used to identify kind of larger archaeological features, but some of the more recent declassified imagery is up to kind of 1 meter resolution, which is really, we are able to detect smaller sites as well. And it really is useful because it gives us a perspective back into the 1970s and 1960s, again, before a lot of sites might have been damaged. I mentioned, we will talk about historical aerial photography. Often that's very difficult to access simply because it's held in archives as a solid material, and it can be very expensive to access. But there is an ongoing project by the University of Berkeley and Stockholm University to scan and make available a huge amount of imagery from British mapping archives covering large parts of Africa and certainly Southeast Asia from the 1940s through to the 1980s, which will hopefully become accessible through Google Earth Engine by 2024, they're hoping, but they still don't have a website or anything, so it's very difficult to get details about that. But that will kind of change again. It'll be a fantastic new resource that we can use in terms of looking at those kind of landscapes. Again, here's just some information that we don't really need right now about that, the way that information was collected in the 1960s, 1970s, where information couldn't be transferred digitally. So, physical film was collected and then dropped and collected on the ground. So how are we using satellite remote sensing? In AMINA and many other projects, we're using it for prospection. We're trying to identify and interpret archaeological features, often in areas that have not really been surveyed archaeologically before. So we're collecting data about sites that have never been, at least been documented. They may be known locally and by people on the ground, but they've never been collected en masse. And we're also trying to observe change detection. So changes on the Earth's surface, generally man-made, but sometimes natural, that might be affecting an archaeological site. So just in the background here, we can see the ruins of an archaeological site. It's probably been excavated relatively recently, but we can see the encroachment further down of both agricultural areas, but military areas as well, large kind of redoubts that are built to hold military forces. So that would be seen as a potential threat to this site. And we see a trench system as well to the north. So how do we learn image interpretation? As we say, some people assume that we have some kind of special skill. It's experience more than anything. It's one of those issues where if you keep trying and you keep making mistakes, you learn and you get better over time. Again, it's going from the known to the unknown. So going to landscapes that you know, looking at them, looking at how things have changed, how buildings look, how vegetation looks, and changing and adapting that to a new landscape that you're looking at as an archaeologist. Now, where we're working in the Middle East and North Africa, because a large part of that area is quite arid, satellite imagery is very useful because you have very little vegetation cover And because there's very little vegetation, structures are often built in stone, which are very visible on a satellite image. So just to give that issue about what a satellite image is showing from above and on the ground, here we can see areas of vegetation, a bridge, and agricultural fields down here. And if you were in the middle of that on the ground, this is how it would look. So it's that process of going, just trying to understand and kind of there is almost kind of I suppose it's a bit like any other archaeological process, like field walking, where at first you're looking and you can't see anything in a field, but after days of walking back and forth, you can spot the smallest kind of piece of pottery. It's kind of getting your eye in and adjusting to what you're seeing on a satellite image. And again, knowledge becomes, really local, and ground knowledge is really useful when we're doing that. Unfortunately, in the AMINA project, we often don't have that possibility, just in terms of economically visiting areas, but also, as I mentioned before, those areas that we can't reach because of conflict or other difficult access issues that are stopping us visiting sites. But over time, we are able to kind of build up, again, through that making of mistakes, understanding the different archaeological sites. So here we see stone-built, probably a tomb, a cairn feature that we would call a pendant, and a ringed cairn. And here, a structure, ruined structure with possible subdivisions inside. And when when people first see these, they look things can look so peculiar from space that they can be missed when you're first working on something, but also modern features can sometimes look ancient or unusual enough that you don't recognize them from space. So we're really, when we're talking, and again, we're not talking about multispectral analysis here, we're talking about optical analysis, visual analysis of imagery. It really has a history going back at least 100 years from the advent of kind of mass use of aerial photography during the First World War. And many archaeologists who were involved in that conflict came out with ideas of how they could use imagery, but again, access to imagery was often difficult, and that's why we're seeing a real revival of this over the last 2 decades. And as I said before, the advent of Google Earth in particular has given a lot of people access. And I remember when Google Earth first appeared, about kind of 2008 was when it appeared with high resolution imagery. And I was very I used aerial imagery, but I didn't really use satellite imagery. And it didn't seem to be something that added much to the work I was already doing. And in fact, the strange circularity of these things, the symmetry of it, I noticed that one of our final speakers, Jonas, was the first person I ever saw using satellite imagery, and he was actually working in a much more difficult environment, looking at southern Brazil. And I remember thinking, is this cost effective? Does this make sense? But it was only through watching him doing that I kind of came to appreciate that actually it is. And there is a lot of people look at remote sensing data, and there is a lot of skepticism just within archaeology. People, if you haven't visited a site and excavated a site, your data is seen as of less worth. So it's finding ways that we can kind of add value to those debates and show that remote sensing data is incredibly useful, and it's compared to my kind of early assumptions about Jonas's work, it is incredibly cost effective. So again, there were lots of factors that will influence how we're looking at a satellite image, particularly the image itself, and the casting of shadow is a huge thing. So we think that the satellite isn't necessarily taking the image straight down, and also the sun's movement during the day will affect how a site looks. So here's an example of a large fortification with a road that's been, or perhaps a water channel that's been cut through the center. And on different images, it's represented differently. Here in kind of spring, we were able to see water around the fort, showing that there was probably a ditch surrounding it, but that's very difficult to observe in the drier or early autumn months. Quickly mentioning crop marks and soil marks, these aren't particularly relevant for the work we do in the Middle East and North Africa, because there are, it is largely an arid region, and because the growing season is so short, there's often very little opportunity to observe these. But basically, when we're seeing, we can often see marks of subsurface features that are represented above ground, because it affects both the way that the soil looks, but also the way that crops grow through the season. And this is much more relevant for kind of the aerial archaeology work that we do in the UK, where we have a slower growing season and a lot more arable and pasture land. But these can sometimes be represented on satellite images. Here are two sites where either there are subsurface features or you had a larger feature like a tell, an upstanding mound that has been either ploughed or dug away, and we're seeing the representation of that as a soil mark and as a crop mark on the ground of imagery today. And some of the more discrete features are becoming observable as the resolution of satellite imagery gets better, as we're getting to that kind of 0.3 meter resolution. So we will see more impact from that kind of analysis. But as I said, we're generally looking at stone-built structures in the Middle East. So for instance, here, very clearly in basalt rock, it's very black. We can see structures and possible mounds built in several areas. But also we have that thing of how satellite imagery is represented. And so for here on the right, we can see the kind of contrast between not being able to understand the topography and the kind of vertical height of a feature and how different will look on the ground. Excuse me, I should have got myself a glass of water. When you come to using Google Earth Pro, there are kind of techniques that you can use to kind of observe that topography. So they do have a very kind of crude photogrammetric system built in that allows you to tilt your screen and observe a site. So for instance, here is a large structure built on a small promontory surrounded by in-use fields, terraced fields. And by using that, we can see exactly its location in a landscape above a kind of wadi channel, a dammed wadi course down here, and these kind of higher mountains in the top left of the image. And again, we see lots of features, sometimes modern or geological features that might, look like they're archaeological, these kind of geological features observable here, and the kind of generic central pivot agricultural systems creating these circles that could look archaeological, and the way that soil is dumped and moved can create features that look kind of strange enough that sometimes they can be mistaken for archaeological features. Now, our colleague Louise Rain, and I should also mention a number of the Amina team contributed to kind of some of the images and ideas in this presentation, kind of developed this idea of how when you first start using satellite imagery, the kind of questions that you ask, this kind of question tree of whether you think something might be archaeological or not. So a series of questions that might lead you to say, no, it's not a site, or we reach the point of it is a site. That's quite useful when you first start working through it, but over time, you will kind of develop a natural kind of way of approaching and understanding these sites. I also talked about condition assessment, how we can use satellite images from different dates to understand how a site has changed. You may see in the news people talk about OSINT, open source intelligence. So they often use satellite images for understanding news events on the ground using satellite imagery to do that. And we're really doing a very similar thing, particularly where we're talking about disturbances to sites, trying to understand what might have happened to a site and when it happened. So here's a particularly infamous example from Palmyra, where members of Islamic State destroyed a large part of the site. And we can see between 2014, we can see a large structure standing in the center of the site, partly through the shadow it's casting. And again, there's that shadow cast image here. So you have a wall here that looks just like a single wall of the same height, but we can use the shadow to understand the different height of that wall. And again, unfortunately, from 2016, after a large part of that site had been demolished, we can see just a small part still standing with its shadow cast, and unfortunately ruins from across the rest of the site. But we do this on a different scale, on different types of disturbances, many of which aren't intentionally destroying or damaging sites. In fact, most damage that we record is incidental, particularly related to agricultural change or kind of urban expansion. We can use lower resolution imagery over a long period of time to kind of understand changes in the landscape. So here is an example from Syria, where between 1984 through to 2014, we can see the impact of the construction and the filling of a large dam system and how that's affected the site. And again, that will allow us to kind of observe, where perhaps potentially sites have been lost. And we can draw on as many kind of, particularly, as archaeologists, we're not particularly well funded, as many free sources of imagery as possible to undertake this kind of work. So as I said, Google Earth is the main source that we go to, but also Bing Maps and Apple Maps for high resolution imagery. Unfortunately, we can't, this is ready process data, so we can't do any kind of multispectral analysis with this, but it's been a game changer to the kind of work that we can do. Google Earth in particular, we'll talk about this more in a moment, because it contains a very kind of crude GIS system that allows you to record geospatial data, is a particularly useful tool for recording sites at a basic level. But we have those lower resolution satellite images and historically classified satellite images that are available from sources such as the European Space Agency and the USGS. So they are the kind of the first place that you would go, but new sources are coming online all the time, and some companies, commercial companies, do make imagery available to academic research, so it's always worth investigating these and approaching these companies where possible. As we said, Google Earth is particularly useful because it has these kind of, and we're talking here about Google Earth Pro, the desktop version, not the kind of Google Earth that you would just access online through Google. It's particularly useful because it has imagery of different dates and is regularly updated, and has this basis of recording data within keyhole markup language, which is an increasingly kind of old-fashioned data type, but is still usable and easily transferable to GIS. So we train everyone, and we ourselves use Google Earth Pro as the main satellite imagery access point. And so, as we mentioned before, you have a low resolution of understanding of what a site is from a satellite image. So what we do in AMINA, we're not really going to talk about this here much, is we have certainty levels. So we talk about how certain we are of what we're observing and what we're interpreting it is. And as part of that, what we do, and we're not necessarily saying anyone else should do this, and perhaps I would definitely say no one else should do this, is we break things down into both an understanding of their form and an interpretation of that site. And that allows us to get around, sometimes we can see something and we're absolutely positive it's archaeological, but we have absolutely no idea what it is. So we can be very sure that, for instance, something is a large mound, and we might be a lot less certain that when we interpret it as a tell. So we would say this is a large mound and we have a high certainty, but at the same time, we think it's a tell and a settlement, but we have a very low certainty because we don't have any additional data. So that's how we're breaking down things in AMINA, because our primary source of data coming in, although we bring in published sources from excavated and ground survey sites, most of the data that we're bringing in and where we're adding the most value is where we're surveying using remote sensing in areas that haven't really been investigated before. Here's another example where a cairn on the ground, which would look like this circular heap of stones, and how we observe it from a satellite image. And again, we would say this is definitely a small mound of stones, but we might be a lot less certain that it is a tomb, grave, or burial, because often cairns don't actually contain burials there, perhaps representative of something else. We saw these images before about color texture differences and how we might interpret those. Much more difficult is things like structures, where you have very complex features that are only observable in a very limited way from above. But again, it's that identifying kind of characteristic features of certain types. Mentioned before, kind of domes on top of structures in the Middle East and North Africa are often representative of religious sites, and fortifications will often have these kind of indented turret systems. And so these kind of small observations that over time we can kind of build up better understandings of sites. And then we just have much more generic types of sites that we can say very little about, where we're seeing things that are definitely structures. There's no roof, so we can assume that they are of some age, but we can say very little more about them. And again, this breaking into form and interpretation allows us to kind of push that. And that brings to another question of when you're using remote sensing, what exactly are the kind of research questions you are, what is pushing you to use this kind of work and this kind of methodology? For AMINA, we're trying to collect data of all site types, of all periods, but you might be kind of bringing in a much more kind of focused questions about certain site types. So that will again influence exactly what you are recording. And even within AMINA, we have debates about what should and should not be recorded, and that's kind of quite natural. And then you get incredibly complex sites. So you have a single structure that might be interpreted as containing multiple different components. And again, we're getting to the kind of the exact methodologies that you might use in your recording schemes, but it's just giving an idea of how different sites are looking and how we have different approaches for kind of interpreting and understanding those sites. And this is in the Middle East and North Africa. You will obviously be observing very different site types in different locales around the globe. And again, much more specific here, talking about churches and temples in a Middle East and North Africa context. And again, that issue of perspective in upland areas. So vegetated areas can be difficult to work in, but also upland areas where the satellite image is distorted by that vertical change. So here we're looking at a structure almost built into the cliff face, and there are all sorts of kind of structures like this, particularly cave features and rock art that you simply can't observe from a satellite image. And we have to be very aware of the biases that we create in the kind of sites that we're recording from a satellite image, but just how kind of difficult some of these can be to observe from a satellite image. And again, here an example of field systems. And I'm aware that time's getting on, so I'll come to the end and I'll let Sayantani just come in now and close with some kind of reflections on our work in terms of training in the Middle East and North Africa. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. That was great. I'll just quickly say that based on all these things that Michael has said, we have learned in EMINA that everyone can learn remote sensing, and can use it. Since 2017, EMINA project has conducted quite a few training workshops, training programs with our colleagues from the MENA countries. Azadeh knows quite a lot about it. We have been comrades in many a battle. And so it has been possible for our colleagues in these countries to learn the system, to use freely accessible sources and record, and they're now recording sites and heritage into the database, and in any ways they can. So the point is, so based on our experience, we have learned that we can use it, everyone can use it, and we have developed this material into an online form called the MOOC, where we can use it as a course and learn the basics from it. I'll leave it here. Yeah, time is running out. So if you have any questions, you can ask us questions now.
Thanks very much, Michael and Sayantani, and for this wonderful, Michael, overview of how to use remote sensing in archaeology. What is remote sensing? How you're, especially at EMINA, using satellite imagery to identify and detect sites. We can have a time for a quick question if the audience have any questions now, or you can type in your question and we can come back to them later. But if there are any questions right now, I haven't seen any in the chat, but you can just raise your hand and ask your questions. If I don't see any hands, we're gonna, just because of the time, we're gonna go to our next lecture, and then together with both lecture, we're gonna have time. And if there are any questions to Michael for the first presentation and Sayantani, you can ask them. We have, okay, one question we can answer now, and then we move to our next. Kazala, can you unmute yourself and ask your question, please?
Okay, thank you very much for the presentation, and I'll be very quick. In your satellite image, how can I say, analysis or view, collection of satellite images, do you have a systematic way of arranging the satellite data? Like, for example, if you're using Google Earth, ArcGIS, or QGIS, you can divide them into grids and then have a systematic way of analyzing the data, or do you randomly collect the images if you're looking at the site? Thank you.
Sorry, I'll try and answer. I think I understood. Because of the scale of the project, we do, like I said, we do everything on Google Earth, and it's really, we in a very terrible way, we have divided up the landscape into grids, and we work through systematically on a spatial level. So we will work kind of through an area systematic like that using Google Earth. We generally will only use, just because of time pressures and the scale of our project, there's 20 depending on your definition of what is and isn't an independent country, 20 plus countries. And so what we tend to do is we use, Google Earth, and we will use the best available image that we can see on Google Earth. Although we have the option of looking at images of different dates, we just use the best because it would take too long to repeatedly go through and look at every available image. So we are taking that risk there that maybe we're using an image that one site wasn't available on, wasn't visible on, and we will miss it. But just in terms of those time constraints mean that we always kind of, we approach it very rapidly. So if you were doing a much more detailed survey of a specific area, you would be able to kind of develop a much more systematic analysis of every available resource, but we simply don't have that capacity. I hope that answers your question, and let me know if it doesn't, or email me afterwards if there isn't time.
Very well answered. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And now we're going to move to our next speaker. The next speaker is our next guest speaker is Dr. Rajani from the National Institute of Advanced Studies in Bengaluru, India. And she's going to talk to us about how she's using remote sensing in her work to identify sites in India. Thanks, Dr. Rajani. Yes, I think you're already unmuted and you can share your screen.
Thank you, Azadeh. Can you please confirm whether you're able to see my screen and in full screen mode?
Yes, we can. It's still not in presentation mode, but we can see your screen.
Is it now in presentation mode?
Not yet, no. Yes, now it is.
Okay.
Great,
okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. I hope I'm audible too and clear.
Very clear, yes. Thanks.
Thank you very much. So I'll start off my presentation and hopefully we'll have some time for discussion later. Thank you very much, Azadeh and your team, Mahasa team, for inviting me for this event, and really wonderful to have such a selection of people from different parts of the world. So, with or without our consent, details from our daily lives are being captured and stored in vast digital databases. If humanity were to vanish tomorrow, and alien historians chanced upon these databases centuries hence, they would have incredibly rich resources for studying humanity's past. As humans in the 21st century, trying to understand our own past, we have no comparably detailed databases to tap into. Instead, we must scavenge for traces of human past activities that have survived in material form and develop expertise in interrogating these material before their secrets fade into oblivion. To scrutinize written records, we turn to historians. We rely on archaeologists to scrutinize ancient material, ranging from small-scale fragments of pottery, jewelry, bones, and bricks to large-scale artifacts such as individual buildings and whole settlements. In each of these domains, scholars have benefited from scientific development that are constantly expanding the kinds of ancient materials that are interrogable, and technological advances that enhance our ability to extract useful information from them. Remote sensing contributes to a branch of archaeology that scrutinizes landscapes, such as this, for instance, at Nalanda in Bihar, India. Humans necessarily scar the landscape when they construct structures, forts, canals, tanks, and road networks. These scars, which can survive for many centuries, are also material records of past human activity and are therefore worthy of study. However, these scars are difficult to discern at ground level, and their value was largely unrecognized until they were observed from an aerial perspective, initially from aircraft and more recently from satellites. Lieutenant Colonel Beasley, a sapper of the Royal Engineers in Mesopotamia during World War, spotted distinct outlines of ancient canals in the course of his repeated flights over the then enemy territory, Tigris and Euphrates plain. While carrying out a survey of contested area beyond Baghdad, he wrote, "The remains of an ancient city were disclosed, which would not otherwise have been discovered in all probability. It was old Samara." A more recent example here is a false color image of Bangalore, where I live, And here is a map of Bangalore made in 1791, which shows a four-cornered settlement and an oval citadel on the south. If you carefully analyze the satellite image, we can still identify where exactly was the old settlement. We can still see the pattern. Apart from such images, analysts can pull together spatial data from other sources, including old maps, paintings, textual reports, and field surveys. Here is an example of Kollam in Kerala, India. Here are two maps made by the Portuguese in 1630 and 1635, by the Dutch 1687, and a Dutch artist by a drawing in the 1760s. And then using these, we can identify common features and contextualize what we have as remains on ground, and use satellite imagery, and we can identify what was the Dutch extent, which is the yellow fortification wall, and what was the Portuguese extent, which is the pink fortification wall. This coherent spatial view allows an analyst to hunt for visual patterns in the landscape in a manner akin to an art historian examining a painting through an appropriate historical lens. Furthermore, just as a modern art historian uses technology to scrutinize what lies beneath the topmost layer of paint, advances in technology of remote sensing permit satellites to view landscape in different wavelengths, just as explained already by a previous speaker, and reveal hidden layers of human artifacts. The purpose of such analysis is to identify, understand, conserve, and protect remnants of our past. This field therefore brings together knowledge from archaeology, history, art history, architectural history, heritage science, geoarchaeology, geomorphology, remote sensing, and GIS, and cultural heritage conservation and management. Although I'm not an expert in all these domains, my research group has brought elements from each of these domains in investigating landscapes surrounding several archaeological sites that we have had immense satisfaction of contributing to our overall understanding of these sites. While all these sites are situated in India, the ones marked in red, in the Indian subcontinent, my research has helped me recognize and articulate universal principles that I'm excited to present today. Here, the idea I want to discuss is called landscape archaeology, role of remote sensing and GIS. The primary focus here is on built heritage that have made marks on Earth's surface in the process of being built or modified. These structures constitute the known remnants of built heritage at a site and its possible hitherto unknown remnants associated with the site still exist in its vicinity. Consider the vicinity of the site of Nalanda, which I showed an aerial view of earlier. When we visit the site protected by Archaeological Survey of India, we see these sacred temple structures called chaityas. There are 6 of them. And there are 10 dwelling structures, monasteries called vihara. Each has a central hall surrounded by monastic cells. This infrared image shows the protected site of Nalanda and the area immediately around it. Notice how 4 temples in the protected region lie at regular intervals along a straight north-south line. If Nalanda had more temples, one might expect them to lie further along this line. Sure enough, the infrared image suggests the presence of one unexplored mound to the south and one to the north. In the north, one can also see 2 crop marks at exactly the intervals we are expecting. The central thesis of my presentation is that a careful study of a site's vicinity or spatial context can lead to 2 important types of discoveries that may improve our overall understanding of the site and inform our strategies for its protection. Firstly, the discovery of further instances or attributes of built heritage, and secondly, the discovery of artifacts such as former water bodies, canals, and mounds associated with past human activity at the site. The next idea I want to discuss is landscape morphology and spatial patterning of archaeological signatures when viewed from above. By viewing a landscape from a vantage point of aerial or space platform, one is able to observe how landscape evolved over time and also get a sense of the implications of this evolution for the analyst seeking to identify archaeological features from above. For instance, the well-known example of a crop mark in the fields first observed in the aerial photos of World War I and II turned out to be surface impressions of buried fort wall and adjacent moat. But this is only one of many different ways a landscape can morph itself, which depends on what has been happening subsequently on the surface. Even in an urban jungle like cities, one can see traces of past layout which are inscribed as roads or land use patterns. A ruined, disused wall becomes hindrance in mobility, and people and goods move along it, creating paths, which over time become roads and remain as permanent scars, even if land use on either side keep changing. For instance, let's take an example at Old Delhi. Jama Masjid and the Red Fort are easy to identify on Google Earth image. Lal Killa was the citadel. Lal Killa, also known as Red Fort, was the citadel of a much larger fort encircling a settlement called Shahjahanabad, which no longer exists. But can we still see its scars? Let me cheat by overlaying the satellite image with a 19th century map of Delhi, which shows the surrounding fort. Now I hide the map, and suddenly you see where the fort lay. This is an example of how a site looks in an urban area. Similarly, the manifestation of sites in different kinds of land surfaces vary accordingly. When I was writing my book 2 years ago, I wanted a term to refer to the landscape in the vicinity of the site that included area that affects the site as well as area affected by the site. Since none of the existing terms seemed suitable, I called it spatial context. For a given site, we would like to identify features in satellite imagery of its spatial context that may provide new archaeological insights for that site. When we look at a site's spatial context today, we see only the present point in its evolutionary trajectory. For some sites, we may have historical spatial records that provide multiple snapshots of the spatial context as they change over time. These records may date from a few years ago, such as from Google Earth images, to a few decades ago, such as from Corona satellite series imagery, to a few centuries ago, such as old maps, painting, and spatial descriptions in historical texts. Even with multiple snapshots for a site, our data is generally too sparse to precisely infer the sequence of gradual changes to its spatial context. This lack of data forces us to guess how the spatial context evolved and to use these guesses to explain why we can or cannot observe certain features. Images may directly show certain surface features, while some subsurface features may only be visible indirectly through certain morphological expressions. For example, here is a 19th century map of Lal Kot and Kila Rai Pithola. This is also part of Delhi, which shows the spatial layout and shapes of fort wall. Then an image of 1965, which shows quite a bit of the fort wall. The fortification itself was 12th century or so, but even in 1965, we could see quite a bit of the fort wall. And then a recent image where most of the land use over, along and around the fort wall have changed. In most cases, recent image is what we have, and we have to hypothesize the reverse order, which is sometimes aided by old images, maps, or records. Thus, understanding the landscape morphology and spatial patterns of site provide the basis for answering critical questions such as what kind of features should I be looking for in a satellite image, and why can't I see what I'm looking for in a particular image? The next idea I want to discuss is the science and technology of remote sensing in context of archaeology. It was also addressed in the previous presentation by Michael. There are various types of imaging technologies that are operational on contemporary and retired Earth observation satellites. Understanding these help the analysts answer the question, is this type of satellite image likely to be useful for my analysis? For instance, look at this image of a landscape of Belur, which is not far from Bangalore. It's about 3 hours from Bangalore, Karnataka. The one on the left is a false color image. It's a coarser resolution, but a false color image with infrared band. It shows the circular moat that surrounded the old settlement. You see a red ring that surrounded the old settlement. There's a temple right in the middle whose picture I have put here. Whereas the natural image on the right, though of higher resolution, doesn't show the circular pattern so clearly. Understanding the science behind these technologies help in answering the inevitable follow-up question, why and why not? Such as this diagram showing how light of visible versus infrared wavelengths is reflected off a leaf, causing this bright vegetation pattern in infrared images. Similarly, there are other imaging technologies like microwave, LiDAR. Understanding the science of those would immensely aid appropriate interpretation. The next idea I want to discuss is GIS, an array of tools for archaeology. GIS is an associated technology that is used for analyzing remote sensing images. Images by itself is like a photograph, but bringing images to a GIS platform fixes this image to its geo coordinates, doing which enables overlaying multiple spatial layers like maps, images, field records, making measurements, analytics, and extracting information from them. So here I discussed a few ideas, but these ideas, when applied to a particular site, most sites are in very complex settings, especially in Indian context. We don't get any one site which is fully covered by vegetation or fully covered by settlement or fully covered in cities. So quite a lot of sites have partially covered by settlements, partially by agriculture, and so on, partially by vegetation and so on. So here is a set of sites I chose from across India to discuss why it is important to know what a site is like. In our experience, here I briefly illustrate 5 case studies to demonstrate that there is no fixed answer to the question, how should I conduct geospatial analysis for sites of interest? This is to re-emphasize the core ideas and the themes discussed earlier in more complex settings. In our experience, there is no fixed or formulaic approach to geospatial analysis of an archaeological site because the process of analysis is sensitive to variation between sites. These variations can be grouped into 5 principal categories. First one, variations in the features of interest. These will vary across sites in terms of their scale, their architectural styles. Second one, variations in the natural setting and subsequent natural changes. Sites vary in terms of their terrain like flat plains, hills, etc., as well as their exposure to natural processes such as weathering, floods, etc. Third, anthropogenic changes. Sites will vary in terms of subsequent human activities and their impact. Fourth, satellite imagery. Data from satellites may be plentiful for some sites, but limited for others. Fifth, historical spatial records. That is, the quality and quantity of such records may vary across sites. The purpose of this discussion is to illustrate how the process of analysis responds to these variations. Thus, we have carefully chosen 5 sites so that there are significant variations across these sites in each of these 5 categories. However, I'm going to only spend one slide for each site. Here is Nalanda, about which I spoke to you already. Here is an example. The inset gives you the extent of the protected area, whereas the larger map gives you the water body distribution around the protected area, and also a paleo channel that would have brought water to the region from nearby river. So this is a site that was active between 4th and 5th century till about 12th century. And the area is largely agricultural, with smaller settlements. Agra, which is the site of the famous Taj Mahal, most people who visit India visit this site first. Here is a map of Agra that was made in 1720. Using this map actually shows the layout of Agra as it was at the peak of the Mughal Empire. Using this map, we were able to trace most of where the settlement lay and what is the condition of various components of the settlement. Here is another example from South India, from a site from the 18th century, using some features that are visible on ground, an old map and painting. We were able to identify a layout of a garden, Tipu Sultan's period garden. Here are the dove cotes that used to be in the entrance of this garden, two of them, one standing erect and one collapsed. Here is the satellite image which we use to identify the layout. This also shows the context of these features, and an old painting which helped us identify the entrance of this garden and also the layout of the garden. There is another example of a site that was active from the 5th century onwards till about 12th, 13th century. This site was complex as it has sand accumulation subsequent to its activity. Using satellite imagery, we were able to identify old canal and area that was cultivated, a rectangular feature that was reservoir, and a fortification wall. Based on our identification and handing over our report to the Department of Archaeology in Karnataka, excavations were conducted, and the report of my work was done in 2006 to 2009, and the excavation the following year, and the excavation report was published a couple of years ago. Mahabalipuram is a site in the east coast of India. Again, here using a 17th century map, a coastal map, we were able to identify some archaeological features which gave us reference also to understand how the coast has changed over time. The last idea I want to discuss here is something called site protection boundaries, a double-edged sword. So far, I have given examples of how remote sensing shows features in the vicinity of sites that were originally part of site. Therefore, if I ask the question, can geospatial analysis be used for preserving, conserving, and managing cultural heritage sites? The answer would be confident yes. But let's see what happens in practice now. Archaeological sites in India are governed by an act, a site that should be recommended for protection based on its authenticity and integrity. It is very important to define boundaries to implement protection, because if one did not have protection boundaries, for instance, here is an example of a site that, because of widening of a road, got damaged because the site was not protected. Here is another example of a site that, because of doubling of railway line, had to be moved because the railway lines were already built and came almost to the site. Now, look at, it is quite clear that if we don't put boundaries, the sites are going to suffer, which is, I'm sure, the case in many other countries as well. But what happens when there is boundary but not properly put boundaries? Here is example of the site of Bodh Gaya. Look at the amount of urbanization in the landscape of Bodh Gaya from around the time it was made World Heritage. to now. Here on the map, I have marked the landscape that was identified as an archaeological landscape in 1861 when the first excavations happened here. And the comparison between 15 years ago, or no, 20 years ago, and now. So we see that the landscape has been built up more in the last 20 years, more accelerated way. So this just raises a question about what does protection when we don't draw proper boundary do. Therefore, site protection boundaries are double-edged sword. Here is an example of a site that I've been working for a long time, Nalanda, which became World Heritage in 2016, with core zone of this much, buffer zone of this much, whereas the archaeological extent that we have identified is much larger. So one wonders, well, will this landscape see the same fate as Bodh Gaya in the next 2 decades? So remote sensing data analysis enables visualization of the limitation in the current practices, and more widely adopting remote sensing and GIS in practice, implementation, and monitoring can address these limitations. I want to just list the 3 groups of users for this kind of work. Students and budding and established researchers in the field of archaeology, history, and art history who see potential value in analyzing the landscape in their region of interest. The second group of users are authorities concerned with the protection of cultural heritage. They are part of international organizations such as UNESCO, as well as national and sub-national agencies. Their mandate include defining property boundaries for protecting archaeological sites and regulating changes to land use in their vicinity. Finally, non-governmental bodies and private professionals who are involved in making maps and master plans for cultural heritage protection and conservation. Adopting remote sensing and GIS would help users in this group develop more efficient and effective processes as they scramble to document and protect thousands of immovable cultural heritage artifacts before these are consumed by expanding cities and towns and other hallmarks of development. I would like to share a picture of my institution where I have been working since 2005, for the first few years as a student, and after a break of few years as a faculty member. So most of the work that I've presented today have been possible because of the support of this institution. I thank you very much for your listening, patience, and thank the organizers for inviting me.
Many thanks, Rajani, for giving us this overview of your work in India, but also talking about the challenges, a kind of how we need to also be careful when we're defining things using remote sensing. It's how reliable or not our interpretation also can be. If we have, we can have one question now, but if you have more questions, please type them and we will get back to them either while other presenters are presenting or after. We can email the answers and kind of all the chats. I can share that with you. So if there is any question now you would like to ask to Rajani, please either raise your hand. I mean, it's faster, I think, if you just raise your hand and unmute and ask your question. If I don't see a hand, you can go ahead and type your questions. And also to Iamina, there was already a question that Michael about identifying small objects using satellite imagery. Michael kindly answered that question. It's in the chat. Again, I will share the chat's conversation with you after the workshop, but you can continue and type your question. If our presenters are not there to answer, we will direct your questions to them in email and put you in touch with them. Our next presenter is from a MESAM Teams member, Nadia Khalaf from University of Exeter, and she's going to show us examples of site types identified using satellite imagery in Africa. Nadia, you can unmute yourself. Over to you.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, and maybe good evening, depending on where you are. Hopefully you can see my screen and hear me well.
So today I will be discussing site types in Africa. This is a very simple demonstration of the different site types we have, and I'll only be looking at Google Earth and Bing imagery, which is all free to use. So I hope it's super useful for people out there. I won't be discussing any advanced types of remote sensing, such as that's been described somewhat already. So it'll be like a little tour, I guess, of Africa. If I can get my slide to move, that would be good. There we go. So obviously, when we talk about site types in Africa, we have to remember that Africa itself is huge. And I'm sure many of you have seen this map before, which is from The True Size of Africa by Kai Kraus. The landmass of Africa covers 6% of the Earth's total area and 20% of its land area. So it is huge. It has the longest record of human habitation in the world and has vast, wide-ranging archaeology. That being said, there's no, even though I am demonstrating some site types in Africa, there's no universal approach to site types in Africa, as each region is unique. So I've tried my best here to describe what we've been mapping as a project, but it's by no means exhaustive, and there are many, many sites that I've already covered. So obviously I've just shown how big Africa is. The landscape diversity is enormous. This is an image from the African Land Cover project by the European Space Agency. We'll be talking about land cover later, but I just thought I'd show you it at the beginning. And because we have this diversity of landscapes, it means that it's not so easy to detect all types of sites. In the past, remote sensing has been kind of geared towards what I call high visibility landscapes, you know, the desert areas, the arid areas, where you can see the sites very clearly and they look, you know, very good. We don't necessarily get that in all areas of Africa, and in a lot of cases we can't actually see sites even though we know they're there. So when we go and find our sites, we largely use Google Earth Pro, as has already been discussed. We also use a grid, and we go along in Google Earth in transects, usually identifying sites that way using the high resolution imagery. We have also used Bing imagery, which is very similar, and we've used PlanetScope imagery, which I won't be discussing today, but that is another example of imagery that we've been using on the MySam project. And today I won't be discussing the historical maps in Google Earth, but this is a snapshot of our last workshop, which is available on YouTube. And if you haven't seen it, I recommend it because it also shows how you might identify sites using historic maps and Google Earth. So my tour will start in Senegal. I basically asked the MySam project or the team members to send me some sites that they've identified that aren't necessarily in the literature. So they've just, you know, been looking through their grids and their transects, and they've found these sites. So we start off with the Senegal team. This is a selection of, I guess, possible mound sites that they found last week, I think. Hopefully they're quite clear to you, but if they're not, I've drawn some polygons around some of them. So you can see the outline here. Obviously through the satellite imagery, we can't tell, you know, if there are archaeological sites for one. Hopefully they are, and we can't you know, we can only see what we can see on Google Earth. They would need ground truthing to establish what they are. And then if we zoom in, we get a finer detail. And then I was also looking at different time spans of this site. So this is so this was this year, and then in 2020, we can see the site in a different view. And you can see the vegetation change around the edge of the site is greener, and you can see that circular kind of structure. The Senegal team have also been looking at shell middens, which you can hopefully see here. This is in the Saloum Delta. I've just highlighted them there for you. They're quite visible on Google Earth, obviously in the river environment, so you can see them quite well. And again, we can zoom in on them to get finer detail, see if there's any erosion or damage to the site at all, or any other features that you may be able to pick up. And again, zoomed in image here. We also have these tumuli that they found, which hopefully you can see in the circle there. These are in the middle of a city, so you have to look quite carefully when you're doing your grids to discover these kind of sites. This is May 2022, so not that long ago, but it's useful to look at different time slides, because this was September 2021, and you might not have noticed them as well as before. So that's May, that's September. And just for context, here is where the site lies, right in the middle of this urban area. So sites can literally crop up anywhere. And I think, well, later we'll be talking about site monitoring, but this would be obviously a site to monitor as it is right in the urban area. And I've just thrown in a known site here from Senegal. So this wasn't found via our transects in remote sensing. This is a World Heritage site, but it's just showing the diversity of sites that can be found in Senegal. And this is the Stone Circle World Heritage site that you can see here. So there is a wide kind of diversity of sites in Senegal that are either known or unknown, which can be seen using Google Earth imagery. Now we go to Mali. So I'm starting in West Africa, if you didn't realise. So this is some sites that Eloise Nock at UCL has been mapping using Google Earth. So this is some possible stone or mud brick structures near Timbuktu. Again, it was detected using Google Earth. And I've just circled them for you here. So hopefully you can see that. And then we can also zoom into a finer detail to see these sites. And again, these would need ground truthing just to be sure what they are, obviously. But that's how we see them. Sorry, could someone mute? Eloise also sent me this possible settlement site in the Mopti region of Mali, which you can see hopefully in the center here. I've highlighted it for you here. And this is in the middle of a kind of riverine area, so you could maybe expect some sort of erosion perhaps, which you can zoom in on here, where you see the vegetation and some erosive features because of the context of where it's in. Again, this site was just found using remote sensing, and there are other similar sites like it in Mali, many in fact, that have been ground truth before, but this one potentially hasn't.
I'm sorry, Nadia, we have your sound is not that clear, and I'm getting a few messages that it's maybe if it's a mic thing, if you can make it closer, or.
Let me see if I can change.
I think it started okay. It's just a distance probably to
Does it sound? Might have to stop the presentation.
now it's okay.
Oh, okay, maybe because
I think it's yes. Now it's fine. Thanks, Nadia. Sorry to interrupt.
Sorry, I didn't realize people could hear me. It's these rubbish headsets they give it at Exeter. I mean, it's got a wire and everything. Hopefully you can hear me. Yeah, so this is a close-up of the site in Mali. And then I put in this site, which some of you may know, as Souk Tadmeka, which has obviously been heavily researched before, just to show what else can be seen in Mali via remote sensing. And this is a huge site of settlement, cemetery, mosque, which you can see here. And then I've just zoomed in so you can see the kind of detail that you can see using Google Earth. And I've just put some other West African examples in, which aren't looked at by the project, but the ones that I've looked at, so I thought I'd throw them in, so quite interesting. Here we have a site near Tiche in Mauritania, and I just wanted to show the difference between using Google Earth and Bing imagery, and I thought that this was a really nice example. So you'll see the reference to the paper that is from at bottom. This is a funerary monument site, has many complex features. This is the image on Google Earth. You can see the archaeology, but it's not exceptionally clear. And then in contrast, here is the Bing aerial imagery, which is also free and available via the internet. So you can just go on Bing aerial and you can get this. And I think the quality is so much better. So when you are looking for sites in your study regions, it's worth flicking between Bing and Google Earth if you can. And then here's a zoomed in area. So you have these tumuli here and then different monuments around. And then I couldn't do a presentation on site types in Africa without looking at my own work in northern Benin. So the blue dots represent areas where we have sites. However, unfortunately, the landscape in northern Benin means that we can't see the archaeology using Google Earth. So this is just an example if you're looking for sites in your area and you can't see them and you're panicking, don't worry, we can't always see the sites. I know during COVID, when people couldn't go on fieldwork, they were looking to Google Earth to potentially find sites as a kind of quick fix, and it's not always possible. So this is an example where it isn't. So these are the sites here, we can't see them, and then this is what they look like from the ground. And as you can see, the landscape is pretty similar throughout. There's no kind of distinguishing features that would show up on Google Earth. However, this area is covered with pottery sherds that we can't see on Google Earth. Now we're going to Sudan. So this is work done by Ed at the University of Cambridge, and he's been mainly working in Darfur. So this is a complex settlement in the area, seen on Google Earth. And here it is, highlighted. And then we have a zoomed in area of the site, which shows how well Google Earth can kind of highlight these areas. That's the 50-meter scale of it, bottom there. This is kind of going to highlight, the use of scale, because obviously if you zoom in and out on Google Earth, you might not spot features. So you might be at this level on Google Earth, so you see the scale at the bottom is 600 meters, and you might not quite see the sites. It's worth obviously changing the scale. So here, obviously you can see the color change, which is highlighted, which does show the sites. And there are also sites around it. And then if we zoom in, this 100 meter scale on the bottom, we get this really nice detail that you might not see from a zoomed out scale. The same again here. If you were in your grid and you're looking for sites, you might see this area, and obviously there's the color change from the darker color to the light color, but you might, if you don't zoom in, skip past it. But this is a 400 meter scale. And I put 2 dates in here. So this is 2010. So when I was looking at the imagery, I was flicking through the time slider. And this is 2021. And as you can see on the right-hand side, there's a settlement encroaching this site. But we will be discussing monitoring later. This is just highlighted here. And then when we zoom in, we actually get the finer details of these cairns and other burial features in the area. Here's another example of a mosque and a cemetery in Darfur, where hopefully we can see it quite clearly. And I have zoomed in here so you can see it. And there's possibly on the western edge remains of maybe another structure that was there before. So this shows again what different scales can do when you're looking for the site. Here's some of the work that I've been doing in Ethiopia. So I've been mapping southern Ethiopia, including these complex settlement sites or enclosures, that have been abandoned. Here we can see quite a large one. It's a 200 scale. And then here we see a variety of abandoned enclosures, also in the same area in southern Ethiopia. I've also been mapping some well sites, and I find different wells almost every time I look in this area. There are many, and here's some that I recently found in a crater. There are a lot of them in craters, highlighted here. And if we zoom in, we can see the finer details of these wells here. I'm going to move to central Ethiopia. So here is the site of Nora, which is a mosque site, which we can see quite clearly using remote sensing on Google Earth. Here's another medieval site, which is in central Ethiopia, where you can see the buildings quite clearly here. I just highlighted it there for you. There are also examples in Ethiopia where we have sites but we can't necessarily see them, but we know they're there from survey. Here's an example of a hamlet near Axum in Tigray. From this image, you might not be able to see much, but the hamlet is actually here. So this is just demonstrating that we can't always see the sites necessarily. Now, Kenya. So in Kenya, we have a variety of people working, including Angela and Pamela at the BIEA. We have Stefania Mane has been mapping in Kenya, and so has Elias, both at the University of Cambridge, and there are a selection of sites that the four of them have been looking at. So here's some possible tumuli near Marsabit County that you can see here. These circular
monuments within the white areas.
Here's some abandoned enclosures in northern Kenya, which hopefully you can see quite clearly. And again, you can zoom in and see the finer detail. And again, these sites would need ground truthing, so obviously we don't know what they are. I mean, they could have been abandoned in the recent past or quite a while ago. We just won't know until we ground truth them. We've also been looking at wells and enclosures in Marsabit County, which you can see a snapshot of the landscape here. Again, it would require zooming in. Here are some wells that are pinpointed with the dots, and then when we zoom in, we get a really nice detail of them. This is some of the work that Elias has been doing at the University of Cambridge, mapping cairn features in northern Kenya. So once again, this is the scale of 1 kilometre, and you might look at this landscape and think, where are the archaeological sites? But again, these are the sites pinpointed with the points. And we can't see them until we zoom in into this finer detail. So this is a 100-metre scale at the bottom, and you can see these cairn features very nicely, which look very good, I think. And there are hundreds of these in the northern Kenyan landscape. Now we go to Tanzania. This work has been done by Akin Bwale at the University of York. And he sent me some of these possible sites. So here we have possible settlement. This is on the border, which you can see on the left of Tanzania. Here we have a possible rock shelter, but again, it would need ground truthing. The site itself is obviously very different to the ones we've seen because we can't see any visible architecture, we just see the rocks. So obviously we need some sort of ground truthing to see if this is a site or not. And then I've put in some well-known sites from Tanzania, UNESCO World Heritage Sites, just to show the diversity of what we have. So this is Kilwa. You can see the mosque here on the left. It's very vegetated, but you can hopefully still see the detail of the site. And again, that's ongoing Manara. You have the features, the stone features here, and the buildings again in a vegetated landscape. Now we're in Zimbabwe. The further south I get, the less knowledgeable I am, as I've mainly worked in West and East Africa. So if I pronounce anything wrong or say something wrong, I do apologise. But when you go into your breakout rooms, you will be able to talk to people that have worked in the areas extensively. So this work has been done by Renier at Wits University. And this is the Nyanga area in eastern Zimbabwe. And again, when we talk about scale, this is quite zoomed out, so we can't see a lot. However, when we zoom in, we get this stone wall and terracing features. So you can see the 100-metre scale at the bottom, and they're quite clear on Google Earth. Here again is the Nyanga area, and we see this circular feature here. Again, the vegetation is very different from before, so you have to get your eye in to look at the different sorts of areas to find the sites. And here again, we have a site. This is, you can't necessarily see it very clearly from here. unless you zoom in, which I have done on the next slide. And this is the scale at which Google Earth can go to. So this is 60 meters, and you can really see the fine detail in the terracing here in this vegetative area, which is quite nice. And finally, we have Botswana. This work has been done by various people on the team, including Tabo and Stefania, who have been working in Botswana. Here we have vitrified dung accumulations in the Shashi-Limpopo confluence of Botswana. Again, these sites have been ground truth before, so we kind of know what we're looking for, and advanced methods of remote sensing have been used. But once you get your eye in, you can see the sites using Google Earth. I've just highlighted some areas here. So if you were surveying and you saw maybe similar areas that you weren't sure, you could maybe pinpoint them as maybe areas of vitrified dung. And then obviously you can use advanced remote sensing techniques to highlight if they are or not. And there is a paper on this which I can link in the chat afterwards. Here's the central cattle pattern of early Iron Age sites in Botswana. And again, this landscape is completely different. We have the features aren't necessarily so obvious like other examples that I've shown. However, we do know that the sites are here. And I've just highlighted them there. And you can, if you change the time slider on Google Earth, you can see the different types of landscape, and the sites may be more visible in different ones. So I'll just flip so you can see there. This stone walled features in the Pitsy area are more obvious. So again, this is zoomed in to 100 meter scale, so you can see the stone walling. And this is after a fire where we can see it very clearly, in fact. So again, worth changing the time slider on Google Earth to show these sites. And here are some sites that Stefania's been looking at. Again, there was a fire. So this is before the fire in 2010, and you can see the features, but they're not necessarily very clear. However, after the fire, you can see them, and then they've been drawn on here by Stefania. And that concludes the tour of Africa. So hopefully everyone can hear me, and the 19 messages in the chat, sorry, now 20, aren't that you couldn't hear me. So some conclusions. Hopefully I've shown that there are a diverse number of sites across Africa, and they are visible using open source imagery. However, we cannot see all sites on Google Earth, even if they do have surface features from the ground. You can't necessarily always see them, and they may require further satellite imagery analysis. I always say that using remote sensing should be the first step that someone might take in site identification. However, ground truthing should be undertaken to establish further information, such as chronology and material culture, which is obviously important. Thank you for your attention. Please follow us on social media if you don't already at MySAM Project. We're on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Thank you.
Many thanks, Nadia, for giving this examples, all the examples of site types that you've shown us from different part of Africa. It was very interesting to see. And I think one point that you made was very important, and kind of in all the work that we're doing, that we see things that we think they're archaeology, but then there is that element of ground truthing that you mentioned, that it's needed for people to go underground and make sure that those things are archaeology, and that's something that Michael mentioned in EMINA and also as part of our project MASA, and I think Maysam as well, we're doing is to adding the certainty level of the things that we're recording. If we know they're archaeology, how sure we are, and if we're not sure, then that's that element of ground truthing that comes in play. If there are any questions, please raise your hand and you can ask your questions. Nadia, I think Nadia's frozen now. But you can go ahead and ask your question or either type your questions in the chat box. There was a question about Bing and how it could be used, and the answers are there. The link is there. It's a Microsoft version of Google Earth, let's say. And Michael also mentioned that for Apple users, Apple Maps are also another good source. And of course, you can also use the Bing imagery in QGIS that you're using. But if there are other questions, please raise your hands. If not, then we're gonna continue. You can continue and add your questions, and we go to our next session, which is going to be a live session. I'm sorry. Yes, thanks, Serge, for adding the Bing link for the QGIS. Okay, I think we can now on time to move to our next session. And for this session, we're going to break into 10 different breakout rooms. And this is going to be our live. Oh, just before continuing, I have a hands up. Asta, I'm sorry if I mispronounced your name. Can you unmute yourself and ask your question, please?
Hi, Ajade. This is Dr. Asta. First, before I have question with the first two speakers of this session, and before going to the question, I would like to thank and congratulate you for like organizing wonderful workshops. I guess this one is the third workshop I'm attending with you, and I have I have one question about like how to avoid this. How to, when you are analyzing any Google map or Google images, how taken care to not misinterpret this particular any images. Because why I am asking this question, because few years ago I was surveying around the archaeological site Chiran. Dr. Rajni, maybe she could understand because she has worked in the Bihar. So before going for the actual survey around the Chiran site, I have like consulted the Google images, and while seeing the Google images, I have seen there are lots of small low-lying mounds are there along the bank of Ganga River. So I was so excited because I thought I'm going to get so many satellite settlements or maybe the temporary settlements, but instead of that, when I have reached to the actual place, I have seen there are so many sand accumulated mounds, which was accumulated by this the sand miners or the people who use obtain the sand from the Ganga River for the construction purposes. So this was the incident that happened with me. So that is why I have questioned you how to like avoid the misinterpretation of Google images.
Rajani, do you want to answer? And I think Michael is also
there. I can answer. I mean, I think all of us who do remote sensing have had to deal with false calls. I have had to, and so on. So over time, you develop a sense of experience in recognizing. In the beginning, it is the best way to train yourself is to visit the site and I think the first presentation by Michael also showed how sometimes the local agricultural practices and sometimes accumulation of the harvest sometimes can give strong signals too. There was a site we were working on where we were looking at Buddhist stupas, which are circular, and we found around the same, another circular feature of all around the same size. And we thought that would be And we found it in 2 images of similar seasons. And then a third image of a different season and a different date didn't show it. Earlier date didn't show it. And then looking at higher resolution and finding another of a same season, higher resolution site, we found it was this seasonal harvest, and the way the harvested crops are accumulated in the region and so on. So these things happen. And I don't think, since we are doing remote sensing of Earth, we always have a chance to go and visit the site. It doesn't have to be like, there are my colleagues who work on patterns on Moon and Mars and so on. You have to interpret and believe it. So I feel in the beginning, over time, also because of your familiarity with the place and its practices, you will be able to differentiate. But in the beginning, going to the field and checking will be a way to make sure.
Yes, many thanks, Dr. Rajni. I think this is the first chance to I had got to hear. I have heard your name like many times and with many friends, but first time I have got chance to listen to it. It was wonderful. Many thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thanks very much, Ashta and Rajani, and we're happy. Kind of one of the reasons that we want to continue this online, kind of reaching to as much people as we want platforms, are this sense of connection or connecting people to colleagues, actually. So now we're going to move on to our live session. And that will be in each room. You're going to have one of our colleagues from MASA or MASAM as a moderator and running live Google Earth for you and going into different parts of the world or the areas that you're interested and trying to see the things that can be archaeology. For South Asia, we have one room, and then for Africa, there are rooms based on a few different countries. When I launch the breakout rooms, I'm gonna add here now a document that if you haven't breakout rooms, it show you how, sorry, just need to go to everyone. And then it shows you how you need to where to click. You see the square thing at the bottom of your screen. You click on it, and you choose the room based on the area that you're interested in. And we haven't assigned automatically. We wanted to leave it open for you to decide what is the room that you're interested to join in. But once you chose a room, you have to stay in that room for half an hour in order to benefit the most from this session. So you can't come back to the main room or go to the 2 different rooms. I'm gonna just launch the breakout rooms. Okay, so now you should see a pop-up window. You just choose the one that you like. And you click on it and you go to the room. Just a very quick message in French for our colleague, francophone colleagues. So pour nos collègues francophones, si vous voulez participer à la prochaine session en français, il y a une session dans la chambre Sénégal. Donc, si vous voulez participer à une session en français, vous pouvez choisir la session ou la chambre Sénégal. Okay, hi and welcome back. We're a bit behind, but I hope that we're gonna either catch up or run a few minutes over the scheduled time. I've added our 2 projects social media in the chat box. This is where you can find information about our project's activities and events. So if you follow us, then you'll learn more about the things that we do along the line. And also I wanted to quickly mention that I understand that the 30 minutes in a breakout room was a short amount of time. It was just kind of a start of this whole using Google Earth. Some of our colleagues, they've prepared examples of sites to go to, and that document, they can now share it in the chat room. If any of the moderators in any of the room, they want to do that, then you can go to those sites on your time. And if you have any questions, then you can email us with the questions back. I'm going to now present our next speaker. She's another MASAM team member, Dr. Pamela Ochungo, and she's going to give us an introduction about land use, land cover, and change detection. Pamela, if you can unmute yourself and share your screen, it's over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Azadeh. Am I audible?
Yes, we can hear you and we can see your screen. It's not still in the presentation mode, but we can see your, yes,
I
it's
think
now.
it should be in presentation mode now.
Yes, thanks, Sandra.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you for a great session in the morning and for organizing this. I think it's very useful for each and every one of us. And I hope that this presentation is going to give you some idea of how, we do some site monitoring using land use, land cover classification methods. So this is just the outline of the presentation. So I'm going to be just introducing what is land use, land cover mapping, which is usually abbreviated as LULC mapping and its importance in archaeology. Then the workflow, what is the workflow of land use, land cover mapping, and a few algorithms that we commonly use for classification. And then touch on training data, its importance in land use, land cover mapping, and how to collect it by ensuring quality of the input data, especially because this is really what matters when it comes to your classification. And then I will look at accuracy assessments and validation because it has been noticed that several times people carry out classification, but without really carrying out accuracy assessments. And in that case, then you really have no means of, assessing or telling just how good your accuracy is and whether your maps are actually usable or not. And then multi-temporal image classifications, which looks at time series, and then finally carrying out change detection, because this can only be done after you have a time series map or maps. So the terms land use and land cover are often used interchangeably. So you'll find many people talking about land use or land cover, thinking that it means the same thing, but each term has its own unique meaning. And looking at FAO definitions, land cover is considered as the observed biophysical cover on the Earth's surface, and that is, for example, vegetation, urban infrastructure. But in the strictest sense, land cover, in the purest and strictest sense, it is considered as description of vegetation and man-made features, because bare rock or bare soil are actually the land itself, considered as the land itself, so not so much of land cover. And then it's also disputable whether water is actually land cover, but in practice, the scientific community usually includes all these terms, the bare soil, the vegetation, the water, all of it as land cover. And this is usually the baseline information which you require for thematic mapping and also for change detection analysis. And then land use is characterized by the arrangements, the activities, and the inputs that people undertake in a certain or on a certain land cover type to produce, change, and maintain it. So basically, it is the activities that take place on land cover to do some certain, to make some certain kind of changes. So by defining land use in this way, you therefore establish a direct link between the land cover and then the actions or the anthropogenic actions of people in that environment. And then when these two are used together, that is land use and land cover, then you're talking about human activities and natural elements on the landscape within a specific time frame. And land use, land cover data can be very useful in an array of different fields.